She had given that house 15 years of her life, and they threw her out like she was nothing. Clara Whitlock stood at the edge of the Holloway property with a worn carpetbag in one hand and 7 days' wages crumpled in the other, watching the iron gate close in her face. No warning, no explanation that held any truth, just Edgar Holloway's voice cutting through the evening air, loud enough for the stable hands to hear, accusing her of stealing silver she had never touched. The sun was already sinking behind the ridge. The road ahead disappeared into open wilderness. She was 38 years old, she had no family, no destination, and the only home she had ever known had just locked her out forever. Stay with me until the end of this story. And drop a comment with the city you're watching from, so I can see how far this story has traveled. The gate was made of iron, painted black, and it had always struck Clara as a strange thing to put at the entrance of a home. Gates were meant to keep people out. She had never thought much about that until the latch clicked shut 2 feet from her face, and she understood, with a clarity that felt almost physical, that she was now one of the people it was meant to keep out. She stood there longer than she should have. She wasn't sure what she was waiting for. Edgar to open the gate, maybe, to say there had been some mistake, that he'd gotten confused, that he was sorry. But Edgar Holloway had never been sorry for anything in his 31 years of living, and he wasn't about to start now. Clara turned and looked at the road. It was a dirt road, wide enough for 2 wagons to pass each other if they were careful, and it ran straight for about a quarter mile before it curved south behind a stand of cottonwood trees. After that, she didn't know what it did. She had lived at the Holloway house for 15 years, and she had rarely left the property. There had never been a reason to. She picked up her carpet bag. It wasn't heavy, which was its own kind of humiliation, and she started walking. The first thing she noticed was how quiet it was. The Holloway house was never quiet. Even at night there were sounds. The creak of the old plumbing, the dogs, Mrs. Holloway's clock in the hallway that chimed every quarter hour. Out here on the road there was nothing but wind moving through the grass, and somewhere off to the east, a bird she couldn't name calling out and getting no answer. She walked past the cottonwoods. The road curved south as she'd expected, and then it opened up into a long, flat stretch that seemed to go on forever. The sky ahead of her was deepening from orange to a bruised sort of purple, and the first stars were beginning to show. Clara did not cry. She had spent a fair amount of her life not crying, because crying in the Holloway house was something you did quietly in your room with the door closed and the pillow pressed against your face, and she'd gotten so practiced at not doing it that sometimes she wondered if she still knew how. What she felt, walking that road in the failing light, was something quieter and worse than crying. It was the particular weight of realizing that every sacrifice you ever made amounted to nothing, that you had poured 15 years into a house and a family and a set of standards you believed in, and the people who benefited from all of it had simply decided one day that you were a thief and put you out. She thought about Mrs. Holloway. The old woman had been sharp and demanding and not easy to work for, but she had been fair. More than fair sometimes. She had noticed things. When Clara was tired, when she was struggling, when something was wrong. She had noticed in a way that Edgar, arriving home from his education in the East 2 years ago, simply did not. Mrs. Holloway had died 8 months ago, and everything had changed within a week of the funeral. Clara shifted her bag to her other hand and kept walking. She wasn't sure how far the nearest town was. She thought she remembered one of the delivery men mentioning a settlement called Harrow's Creek, about 12 miles south. But 12 miles in the dark on an unfamiliar road was not the same as 12 miles on a map. Her shoes were good. She had always kept her shoes in good repair, one of those small disciplines she'd held onto because it was hers. But they were not made for 12 miles of frontier dirt. She had been walking for maybe an hour when she heard the horse. It came from behind her, from the north, a single animal moving at a steady trot. Clara moved to the side of the road without thinking about it. You moved aside for horses, that was just sense. And she kept walking and didn't look back. The horse slowed. "Evening?" said a voice. She stopped and turned. The man on the horse was big in the way that came from work rather than size, broad through the shoulders, with hands that looked like they'd spent a long time doing things that required them to be strong. He was wearing a plain hat and a canvas jacket, and he was looking at her with an expression that was difficult to read in the low light. Not threatening, not pitying, exactly. Just looking. "Evening," Clara said. "You heading to Harrow's Creek?" "I suppose so." He was quiet for a moment, looking down the road ahead of them and then back at her. "That's about 11 miles from here," he said. "Dark in 20 minutes." "I'm aware." He shifted in the saddle. Something in his face changed slightly, not softening exactly, but reconsidering. "You got family there?" "No." "Work?" "No." Another pause. He seemed to be the kind of man who paused before he said things, which Clara noted and tentatively respected. "I've got a ranch about 2 miles back east," he said. "My housekeeper left last spring and I haven't replaced her. The house is in a state. I pay fair wages, there's a room with a lock on the door, and I'm not looking for anything other than someone who can keep a household running." He looked at her steadily. "I don't know you, you don't know me, but I'd feel wrong letting a woman walk 11 miles alone in the dark when I've got a spare room and work that needs doing." Clara looked at him. She was not naive. She was 38 years old and had spent 15 years managing a large household and learning to read people the way you had to when your livelihood depended on it. She looked at this man on his horse, and she tried to find the thing that was wrong with him, because there was always something wrong. "What's your name?" she said. "Wes Dalton." "How long have you had the ranch?" 12 years. "And your housekeeper left why?" Something moved across his face. "Her mother took ill in Missouri. She went to look after her." He paused. "I gave her 2 months' wages and wrote her a letter of reference." Clara considered this. "I'm Clara Whitlock," she said. "I've been a housekeeper for 15 years. I was let go today without cause." She paused, because she wasn't going to lie, but she also wasn't going to perform her humiliation for a stranger. "There are people who will tell you I stole something. I didn't." Wes Dalton looked at her for a long moment. "All right," he said. He swung down from the horse, which Clara had not expected. "It'll be easier if you ride," he said. "I'll walk." "That's your horse." "It is," he agreed and held out the reins. She took them, because she was tired and her feet hurt, and she was not so proud that she would walk another 2 miles in the dark to prove a point. She put her foot in the stirrup and pulled herself up. It had been years since she'd ridden, but the body remembered. And she settled into the saddle and looked down at Wes Dalton, who had picked up her carpet bag and was already walking east. He didn't make conversation. She didn't make conversation. The horse was calm and well-mannered, which told her something. The ranch appeared out of the darkness like something that had been there a long time and knew it. A main house built solid and low, 2 outbuildings, a barn, and a windmill that turned slowly in the night breeze. There were cattle sounds from somewhere beyond the barn. A dog came out to meet them, old and slow, wagging its tail without urgency. "That's Biscuit," Wes said. "She won't bother you." The inside of the house was... She searched for the right word and settled on honest. It was honest in its disorder. There were dishes stacked on the wrong shelves and dust along the baseboards, and a smell of pipe tobacco and old coffee, but the structure of the place was sound, and she could see, under the accumulated neglect, that it had once been kept well. There was a quilt draped over the back of a chair that someone had made with real care. There was a shelf of books that had been read, not displayed. Wes showed her the spare room. It was plain, a bed, a chest of drawers, a window that looked east toward the open range. There was a bolt on the inside of the door, heavy iron, installed properly. He showed her this without comment, which she appreciated more than she would have appreciated any words about it. "There's cold food in the kitchen," he said. "Whatever you want, I'll be up early." He looked at her, and again she had that sense of someone choosing their words with some care. "If you decide this isn't right for you, I'll pay you for the day and drive you to Harrow's Creek myself. And if I decide it is right for me, then we'll talk about terms in the morning." He left. She heard his boots on the floorboards, a door closing, and then quiet. Clara stood in the middle of the spare room for a moment. She set her carpet bag on the chest of drawers. She looked at the bolt on the door. She crossed to the window and looked out at the dark range and the sky, which was full of stars now, more stars than she'd seen in years, because the Holloway house was too close to town and the gas lamps bled the sky pale. Her feet were throbbing. She was hungry. There was a knot in her chest that she recognized as grief. Or maybe it was anger, or maybe it was both of those things pressed together so long that they'd stopped being distinguishable. She went to the kitchen and found bread and cold beans and a wedge of hard cheese, and she ate standing at the counter because she didn't quite feel like sitting down yet. Like sitting down would mean she was staying, and she hadn't decided that. Edgar Holloway's voice kept returning to her. Not the words themselves, but the tone of them. That particular register of contempt that meant he had decided she was beneath him, and everything else was just performance. The stable hands watching, the cook pretending not to listen from the kitchen doorway. Clara standing in the parlor with her hands folded in front of her, keeping her face still, refusing to give him the reaction he wanted. She had worked in that house for 15 years. She had managed its accounts, and its staff, and its calendar. She had sat with Mrs. Holloway through 2 bouts of influenza and 1 small stroke. She had learned which of the upstairs floorboards squeaked and which windows let in cold, and exactly how much wood the back parlor fireplace needed to stay warm through a winter night. None of that had mattered. In the end, Edgar had decided she was inconvenient, probably because she knew where things were and had opinions about how they should be run. And he didn't like either of those things. And he'd needed a reason to put her out, and accusing her of theft was the simplest reason available. Clara finished the cheese and set the plate in the sink and looked around the kitchen of this stranger's house. It was not small. It was not badly designed. The stove was a good one, better than the Holloway house's stove, though it needed cleaning. There was a window above the sink that would catch the morning light. The floor was plank and had been sanded at some point, but needed it again. She thought about Wes Dalton saying the house was in a state. He hadn't been wrong, but he'd said it the way a person said something that was true and inconvenient, rather than the way a person said it to make you feel the weight of the work ahead of you. There was a difference. She went back to the spare room and sat on the edge of the bed. She tried to think clearly about her situation, which was something she had always been able to do even in difficult moments. Step back from the feeling and look at the practical shape of things. She had 7 days' wages. She had a carpet bag with 2 changes of clothes, a small sewing kit, some toiletries, and a book she'd read 3 times already. She had no family. She had references. The written kind, which Edgar had not thought to take from her, probably because he hadn't thought she'd need them to matter. She had nowhere to go. That was the plain truth of it. She could go to Harrow's Creek and look for work, but she'd be arriving unknown and on Edgar's word if anyone thought to ask about her. And Edgar's word was the kind that stuck to people. She could go further, to one of the larger towns maybe, somewhere she could be anonymous. But that required money for travel and time she didn't have. Or she could bolt the door, sleep in this bed, and in the morning have a conversation with a man who had given up his saddle so she could ride 2 miles in the dark. She undressed and got into the bed. The mattress was adequate. The quilt was heavy and smelled faintly of cedar. She lay on her back and looked at the ceiling and thought about all the things that could still go wrong. There were many of them. She listed them out honestly and without comfort. Then she thought about the bolt on the door, installed properly. Heavy iron. She got up and bolted it. Then she got back into bed. She did not sleep for a long time, but eventually she did sleep, and when she woke it was to the sound of boots in the kitchen and the smell of coffee, and the window was full of the pale rose light of a plains morning. And for one suspended moment before she remembered where she was, she felt something she hadn't felt in years. She felt like she was somewhere she might be able to stay. Then she remembered, and she lay still and listened to the sounds of the house settling into its day. And she thought, one morning at a time, that's all. One morning. She got up, dressed, made the bed, and went to find Wes Dalton to talk about terms. The terms were simple, which Clara appreciated. Wes paid $12 a month. The room was hers for as long as she worked there, and meals came from whatever she cooked, meaning she ate what he ate, which he said with a kind of mild apology, like he wasn't sure that was fair to her. "What have you been eating?" she asked, looking around the kitchen in the early morning light. "Beans, mostly. Some salt pork, bread when I remember to make it." "Do you have flour?" "Some." "Eggs?" "The hens are hit or miss." Clara opened 3 cabinet doors before she found the flour, which was in the wrong cabinet and had a small moth problem. She closed it and turned around. $12 is fair, she said. "I'll need a budget for the kitchen. Not large, but I can't work with what's here." Wes looked at her like he was trying to decide if she was negotiating or just telling him a fact. She was just telling him a fact. He nodded. "I go to Harrow's Creek on Fridays. You can come and pick what you need." All right, all right, he said, and poured himself a second cup of coffee and went outside, and that was that. She had expected it to feel strange, living in a man's house, alone, no chaperone, no other staff, just the two of them, and Biscuit, the old dog, and the ranch hands who came and went from the bunkhouse, but ate their own meals and kept their own hours. She had expected to feel watched or judged, or like she was constantly explaining herself. She didn't feel any of those things, or at least not the way she'd feared. What she felt instead was the particular pressure of a house that needed a great deal of work, which was familiar in the way hard work was always familiar. Not comfortable exactly, but understandable. She knew what to do with a house in this kind of shape. She knew the order to do it in. She started with the kitchen because that was where everything began. She sorted the cabinets, got rid of the moth-eaten flour, and made a list of what was needed. She scrubbed the stove until her elbows ached and her hands were raw. She found a mop that had seen better days but still functioned and went over the kitchen floor twice. She replaced the shelf paper in 2 of the cabinets. By noon, she had produced a reasonable lunch, beans with salt pork, but seasoned properly, with bread she'd made in the morning, and it was hot, and it was good. And she set a plate on the table for Wes and one for herself, and they sat across from each other and ate without much conversation. "This is better," Wes said, meaning the food. "I found some dried sage in the back of your spice cabinet," Clara said. He looked at her like he hadn't known he had a spice cabinet. She suspected he hadn't. The days established themselves. She was up before Wes most mornings, had coffee going when he came in from his first check of the cattle, and they ate breakfast together in a silence that was gradually becoming companionable rather than merely empty. He was not a talker, which suited her. She had spent 15 years anticipating other people's needs and rarely expressing her own, and the quiet of the ranch mornings felt like something she could breathe in. But the house itself told her things about him that he didn't say. The books on the shelf were worn and well-read, history, mostly, and some fiction, and a dog-eared almanac that went back 4 years. There were 2 photographs on the mantel, one of an older woman with a direct gaze and strong hands, and one of a much younger Wes standing next to a man who had his same jaw, both of them squinting into sunlight. She didn't ask about either photograph. She dusted around them carefully. The quilt over the back of the parlor chair turned out to be one of several. They were stored in a cedar chest in the spare bedroom that had been pushed against the wall and mostly ignored. Clara opened it one afternoon while she was doing a proper inventory of the house, and she found 4 quilts folded in careful layers, each one made with real skill. Intricate patterns, tight stitching, the kind of work that took months. She lifted the top one and looked at it closely. Someone had put serious time and love into this. She closed the chest and moved on, but she thought about it. The outbuildings were not her domain. She understood that without being told, but Wes had mentioned that she was free to use the yard and the kitchen garden, which had gone to weeds over the summer but still had the bones of something productive. She started clearing it in the afternoons when the indoor work was done, pulling weeds with a focus that was almost aggressive, because the garden gave her something that housework didn't, a place to think without interruption. It was the garden that led her to the shed. It was set back from the main outbuildings, half hidden by a stand of overgrown lilac bushes that had been left to do whatever they liked for several years. She thought it was a tool shed at first, and she went looking for a trowel. The door was stuck, swollen in the frame from weather, and she had to put her shoulder into it to get it open. It wasn't a tool shed. There were some tools pushed to the back wall, but the main occupant of the shed was a loom. It was old, older than anything else on the ranch, she thought, and it was covered in a canvas tarp that had done a reasonable job of protecting it from the dust. She pulled the tarp back and looked at it for a long moment, and the feeling that moved through her was strange and sharp and not entirely welcome. She had not woven anything in 14 years. It had started the way a lot of things in her life had started, out of necessity. Her grandmother had taught her when she was a girl, long winter evenings with cold fingers and the smell of lanolin and the rhythmic clack of the shuttle that she could still hear if she tried. She had gotten good at it. Genuinely good, her grandmother said, with a matter-of-factness that meant more than praise. But housekeeping paid and weaving didn't, not reliably, and she'd packed the skill away like old letters and stopped thinking about it. She ran her hand along the edge of the loom. The wood was sound. The frame was intact. Some of the heddles were damaged, and the tension beam needed attention, but it wasn't beyond repair. She stood there in the dusty shed for longer than she meant to, and then she covered it back up with the tarp and went back to the garden. She didn't mention it to Wes that evening. She wasn't sure why. Maybe because she didn't know yet what she wanted to do with the finding, and she didn't want to explain something she hadn't decided yet. But 3 days later, Wes came in from the barn with grease on his hands and found her standing in the kitchen doorway looking toward the shed, and he followed her gaze and said, "You found it." Yes. He washed his hands at the pump outside, taking his time. "It was my mother's," he said. He came inside and dried his hands on a cloth. She wove for most of her life, sold work to 3 or 4 settlements in the territory. He paused. "She died 4 years ago. I haven't been able to figure out what to do with the loom." Clara looked at him. "It's in good shape, mostly. The heddles need replacing and the tension beam needs resetting." Wes looked at her steadily. "You know looms." "My grandmother taught me." She turned back to the kitchen. "I'm not asking to use it. I just noticed." He was quiet through supper. It wasn't an uncomfortable quiet. It was the kind of quiet that meant he was thinking about something, and she had learned to recognize the difference. She ate and didn't push it. 2 days later, she came in from the garden to find him in the shed. He had the tarp off the loom and was looking at it the way a man looked at something he both wanted to fix and wasn't sure he had the right to touch. He heard her come in and didn't startle, just glanced at her. "What does the tension beam need?" he said. She showed him. He had the tools for it and the knowledge of how to use wood that most men who'd built their own outbuildings had. He didn't have her grandmother's specific vocabulary for the loom's parts, and she didn't have his vocabulary for the wood joinery, and they worked around each other's gaps with a kind of clumsy practicality that was occasionally frustrating and occasionally almost funny. They spent 4 evenings in the shed. The light was bad and they were working by lantern, which wasn't ideal, and on the 3rd evening she said, "This would go faster in daylight," and he said, "I can't do it in daylight. I've got cattle." And she said, "I know. I just said it would go faster, not that we should change anything." And there was a silence, and then Wes made a sound that took her a moment to recognize as a laugh. It was short and quiet and unpracticed, like something he didn't do often. When the loom was repaired, he carried it himself, the whole thing, which was heavy, from the shed to the room off the kitchen that she'd identified as the most underused space in the house. He set it down and straightened up and looked at her. "It's yours to use," he said. "Whatever you make with it is yours. I'm not asking for anything from it." Clara looked at the loom sitting in the winter light from the window. It looked right there. It looked like it belonged somewhere finally. "Thank you," she said. She meant it plainly, without the decorative manners she'd been trained to use, and he received it the same way. She started slowly. Her hands remembered more than her mind did, which was both a relief and unsettling. The body holding onto something the conscious self had set down. The first piece she made was small and not particularly good. The tension was uneven in places, and she'd miscalculated one of the color runs and had to cut it out and redo it, which wasted yarn she'd bought in Harrow's Creek and couldn't really afford to waste. The second piece was better. The third piece was something she looked at for a long time when it was done. It was a blanket, heavy wool in 3 colors, a deep rust, an undyed cream, and a grayish blue that the woman at the dry goods store in Harrow's Creek had called Storm. The pattern was one her grandmother had called a running water pattern, diagonal lines that crossed and recrossed in a way that looked like movement. It was the most technically demanding thing she'd tried in this new beginning, and it hadn't gone perfectly. There was one section near the middle where she'd lost count and had to compensate, and if you knew what you were looking for, you could find it. But it was real. It was hers. She folded it and didn't know what to do with it. Wes found her holding it one evening after supper. She was standing near the loom, just holding the folded blanket, and she felt him look at her from the doorway. "Can I see it?" he said. She handed it to him. He unfolded it and held it out in both hands, looking at it the way she'd seen him look at things he was assessing seriously. He took his time. "How much would something like this sell for?" he said. "I don't know. I haven't looked into it." "You should." He folded it back more carefully than she expected and handed it to her. "There's a woman in Harrow's Creek who buys crafts. She sells to the dry goods trade in larger towns. I can introduce you." Clara looked at the blanket in her hands. The idea of selling something she'd made felt exposed in a way she didn't entirely expect, like handing someone a piece of the interior of yourself and waiting for them to put a price on it. I'll think about it, she said. All right. He turned to go, then stopped. It's good work, Clara. Your grandmother taught you well. She didn't answer because she didn't trust her voice right then, and she was not going to cry in front of Wes Dalton over a compliment about a blanket. The woman in Harrow's Creek was named Ruth Adler, and she ran a shop that smelled of cedar and beeswax and had shelves lined with the work of people in the territory, pottery and ironwork and quilts and dried herbs and things in jars. She was in her 60s, small and sharp-eyed, and she looked at Clara's blanket for a long time without saying anything, which made Clara want to take it back and leave. How long did this take you? Ruth said. About 3 weeks. I was working around other duties. Ruth named a price. Clara kept her face still. You think that's too low? Ruth said, watching her. I think it covers the materials, Clara said carefully. Ruth looked at her for a moment, then looked at the blanket again. Bring me 2 more. If they're this quality, I'll give you a better arrangement. She paused. Where did you learn this pattern? My grandmother. It's a running water pattern. I know what it is. I haven't seen it done right in 20 years. Clara took the money and didn't say anything more. And on the drive back to the ranch, Wes had waited with the wagon while she went in. She sat beside him and looked at the flat land rolling past and felt something she hadn't felt in a very long time. Not happiness, exactly. Something smaller and more durable than happiness. The winter closed in. The ranch contracted the way ranches did in cold weather. Smaller, louder with wind, all the space driven inside. Clara kept the fire going and cooked heavier food and spent more of her evenings at the loom, and Wes spent more of his evenings in the house, reading by the fire or going over his accounts at the table. Sometimes they talked, not about anything large, about the cattle, about what was needed in town, about whether the south fence was going to hold through another hard freeze. But sometimes the conversation went other places, and she found herself knowing things about him that you didn't know about a person from surface acquaintance. He had come to the ranch when he was 30, after his father died, because there was no one else to take it. He had not planned to stay this long. He had thought for a long time that he would sell it and go somewhere else, east, maybe, or further west. But he hadn't, and now he wasn't sure if that was because the ranch had become the right place for him, or because leaving had simply stopped feeling possible. Do you regret it? Clara asked. It was late. The fire was lower than it should have been, and she wasn't sure what had made her ask that. Wes was quiet for a moment. Some days, he said, not the ranch itself, just... He stopped, like he'd gotten ahead of himself. It's a solitary life. That's harder than I thought it would be. She nodded. She understood solitary. What about you? He said. What about me? Do you regret it? 15 years in that house? Clara set down the shuttle she'd been holding. She thought about it honestly, which meant not reaching for the easy answer. No, she said finally. I think I regret that I didn't see sooner what it was adding up to, or not adding up to. She looked at the fire. I thought loyalty was enough. I thought if you did the work well and did it faithfully, that meant something. It does mean something. Edgar Holloway didn't think so. Edgar Holloway, Wes said, with a flatness in his voice that told her exactly what he thought of Edgar Holloway, is not the person who gets to decide what your work means. She looked at him. He was looking at the fire, his profile set in that way he had when he'd said the thing he meant to say and wasn't going to add to it. She picked up the shuttle again. The talk in Harrow's Creek started around February, which was earlier than she'd expected, but not a surprise. A single woman living on a bachelor's ranch, there was a script for that, and people reached for it automatically, the way they reached for anything that explained an unfamiliar situation in familiar terms. She heard about it from Ruth Adler, who delivered the information in a way that was matter-of-fact and without cruelty, because Ruth was that kind of person. People are talking, Ruth said, about you and Dalton. I know, Clara said. Does it bother you? Clara thought about it. The honest answer was, yes, some. The thing that bothered her wasn't exactly the gossip itself, but what it assumed, that she couldn't exist in the world without either the protection of a man's name or the suspicion of a man's interest, that there was no framework for a woman who was simply doing her work and building her life, and wasn't, for once, defined by someone else's opinion of her. It bothers me that people don't have better things to think about, she said. Ruth made a sound that might have been approval. You going to do anything about it? No, Clara said. I'm going to sell this blanket and use the money to buy more yarn. Ruth looked at the blanket. It was the fourth one she'd brought in, and she'd found her rhythm now. The tension was consistent, the pattern clean, and she'd tried a new color combination that had come out better than she'd planned. Ruth had been selling them to a goods trader in the larger settlement of Millbridge, 40 miles east, and apparently they were moving faster than expected. She doubled the price arrangement before Clara could say anything about the new blanket. Clara walked back to where Wes was waiting with the wagon, and she climbed up and told him what the new arrangement was, and he said, "Good," without any particular ceremony, which was exactly the right response. They drove back to the ranch in the cold February air, Biscuit appearing out of nowhere to run alongside the wagon the last quarter mile as she always did. And the sky was that particular pale winter blue that felt infinite, and Clara thought, this is mine. Not the land, not the house, not any of it in the legal sense. But this moment, this work, this version of herself that was still in the process of becoming, this was hers. She was not foolish enough to think it would stay simple. She had learned too much about how things change to believe in permanence. But she was here, and she was building something, and for the first time in 15 years, what she built belonged to her. The loom waited for her back at the ranch, half-finished work still threaded on it, and she was already thinking about the next pattern. Spring came to the ranch the way it always did on the plains. Not gradually, not gently, but in a series of arguments between cold and warmth that left the land looking wrung out and uncertain for weeks, before finally settling into something that resembled itself. The mud was spectacular. The cattle were irritable. Two of the ranch hands quit within a week of each other for reasons that Wes explained to Clara with the resigned brevity of a man who'd stopped being surprised by such things. And he spent most of April doing the work of 4 people while she managed the house and the garden and the loom room, which had become, without any formal declaration, a genuine place of work. She had 6 blankets in Ruth Adler's shop. 2 of them had already sold to the trader in Millbridge, and 1 had gone further. Ruth mentioned it almost casually, the way she delivered information she knew mattered, to a dry goods merchant in Calverton, which was the largest town in the territory, and 3 days' ride east. Clara had stood in Ruth's shop and received this information and said, "Calverton?" And Ruth had said, "Calverton." And they had looked at each other with the particular understanding of 2 women who knew what it meant when something you made with your hands traveled further than you'd ever been yourself. The money was not large, not yet, but it was real and it was accumulating, and Clara had started keeping a ledger, a small one, plain cover, that she kept in the drawer of the chest in her room, in which she recorded every sale, every expense, every yard of yarn, and every hour she could estimate. She had her grandmother's practicality about money, which meant she neither feared it nor romanticized it. It was a tool. She was learning to use it. The gossip in Harrow's Creek had not died down so much as shifted shape. By March, it had evolved from simple suspicion into something more specific. A neighbor woman named Dora Fitch had apparently made it her personal project to establish, through a campaign of carefully framed questions directed at anyone who'd speak to her, that Clara Whitlock was either a woman of loose character or a calculating schemer, and possibly both. Clara knew about this because Ruth told her, and Ruth told her because Ruth believed in equipping people with the information they needed, regardless of how unpleasant the information was. Clara had listened to all of it and then said, "Is she someone whose opinion affects my sales?" Ruth had thought about it. Not directly. Then I'll let her talk, which was the decision she'd made, and she mostly held to it, except for one Sunday in late March, when she and Wes had driven into Harrow's Creek for supplies and run into Dora Fitch outside the general store. Dora was a large woman with a small, precise mouth and the kind of bearing that came from believing yourself the moral center of your community. She had looked at Clara and then at Wes and then back at Clara with an expression so loaded with implication that it was practically a spoken sentence. Clara had looked directly at her and said, "Good afternoon, Mrs. Fitch," in a voice that was perfectly polite and completely impenetrable. And then she had gone into the store and bought her flour and her yarn and her dried beans and come back out. And Dora Fitch had moved on, and Wes, who had witnessed the whole exchange, said nothing until they were out of town, when he said, "You handled that well." "I've had practice," Clara said. "With her specifically? With people like her." She looked out at the road ahead of them. There were 3 Dora Fitches at the Holloway house. Women who came to call on Mrs. Holloway and spent half their visit looking at me like they were trying to figure out what I was doing there. What did you do? Served the tea and didn't give them anything to use. She paused. Though I once put dried lavender in Dora Fitch's type of woman's tea when she'd been particularly awful, because lavender gives some people headaches, and I knew she was one of them. She stopped, aware that she had just admitted to something that was either petty or entirely reasonable depending on your perspective. Wes was quiet for a moment. Then that short, quiet, unpracticed laugh again. I'm not going to ask you to tell me who that was. Good, Clara said. The spring passed. May arrived and the mud dried and the grass came up green and the mornings turned from bone cold to merely brisk. Clara expanded the kitchen garden. She had a real plan for it now, not just pulling weeds, but actually planting with intention. And she started a 5th blanket that was the most ambitious thing she'd attempted, a large pattern her grandmother had called the river and sky, which required tracking 6 different threads simultaneously and had defeated her twice at 18 and once already at 38. She was not going to let it defeat her a 4th time. Wes noticed she was struggling with it one evening without being asked how he knew, because she hadn't said anything, and her face tended to be still when she was frustrated rather than expressive. He just sat down across the room with his almanac and stayed there, not talking, not watching her work, just present. And she found that the presence helped in some way she couldn't have explained. She finished the row she'd been stuck on, and then the next one, and by the time the fire was low, she had gotten through what had been stalling her. Thank you, she said, when he stood up to go. He looked briefly puzzled. I didn't do anything. I know, she said. She watched him leave, the way she'd taken to watching people in this house. Not cataloging exactly, but noticing the details that told you who someone actually was. He had not once asked her about Edgar Holloway, not once pressed her for more of the story than she'd given him that first night on the road. He asked practical questions, what she needed, how something was going, did she want him to pick up anything in Harrow's Creek, and he answered practical questions when she asked them. And beyond that, he left her the space to be whatever she was becoming without requiring that she perform it for him first. She was not used to that. She realized somewhere in the middle of May that she had been braced for it to change, for the condition attached to the fairness to reveal itself. And it kept not changing, and she kept being braced, and the bracing was beginning to feel more exhausting than the work. The letter arrived in the 2nd week of June. Wes brought it in from the Friday mail run in Harrow's Creek and set it on the kitchen table without comment. The return address was Millbridge, a firm of solicitors called Greer and Associates. Clara looked at it for a moment before she picked it up. She didn't know anyone in Millbridge. She opened it. The letter was from a man named Thomas Greer, attorney at law, and it was professional in the formal way of legal correspondence. Measured, precise, stripped of anything that wasn't necessary. It said that his office had been retained in a matter that concerned her directly, and that he had information relevant to the estate of the late Mrs. Agatha Holloway, and that he would be grateful if she could arrange to meet with him at her earliest convenience. Clara read it twice. Then she set it down on the table and sat there for a while. Mrs. Agatha Holloway, dead 8 months. The woman she'd sat with through 2 bouts of influenza and 1 small stroke, whose household she'd managed for 15 years, whose clock had chimed every quarter hour in the hallway she'd swept every morning. What could a solicitor in Millbridge have to say about Agatha Holloway's estate that involved Clara? She showed Wes the letter that evening. He read it once, quickly, in the way he read things, and then he read it again more carefully. Have you heard of this firm? She asked. Greer and Associates. I've heard of Thomas Greer. He set the letter on the table between them. He handled the land transfer for a ranch east of here 2 years ago. He's got a good reputation. He looked at her. You want to go to Millbridge? I don't know what I want yet. She looked at the letter. Edgar told everyone his mother left everything to him. He produced a will. At least he said he produced a will. I never saw it. I wasn't at the reading. Were you invited? No. Wes was quiet. The way he was quiet when he was thinking rather than when he simply had nothing to say. The 2 silences were different. She had learned to distinguish them. A solicitor in Millbridge wouldn't write to you about a dead woman's estate unless he had a reason, he said. and he wouldn't ask you to come in person unless the reason was significant. That's what I think, too. I can take you to Millbridge. She looked at him. That's 3 days there and back. I know how far Millbridge is. The ranch. Pete can manage 3 days. Pete was the senior ranch hand, steady and experienced, and Wes trusted him with the cattle in a way he didn't trust either of the newer men. If you want to go, we can go. Clara looked at the letter from Thomas Greer for another long moment. There was something in her chest that she identified, carefully and without letting herself rush toward it, as the first small movement of something she hadn't felt in a long time. She wasn't going to call it hope. Not yet. She'd made that mistake before. I want to go, she said. They left on a Tuesday morning early. Clara packed a single bag. She was experienced at packing efficiently, and Wes had the wagon ready before first light. The drive to Millbridge was long and mostly flat, the kind of flat that was either peaceful or monotonous depending on your state of mind, and Clara's state of mind was neither. She was taut in a way she hadn't been in months, her thoughts returning again and again to Agatha Holloway. She had liked Agatha. That was the truth that she'd kept mostly to herself, because liking your employer was considered either irrelevant or naive, and she was neither. But Agatha had been a specific kind of woman, demanding and exacting and not always kind, but essentially honest. She had said what she meant. She had expected people to meet their obligations, and she had met hers. She had noticed, in that particular way she had, when Clara was doing well and when she was struggling, and she had not always said anything about it, but she had known. In the last year of Agatha's life, she had started calling Clara into the parlor sometimes in the evenings, not to give her instructions, but just to talk. Clara had found it strange at first, and then had found it simply what it was. An old woman who was running out of time and had made the lucid calculation that Clara Whitlock was better company than most of the people she might otherwise spend her evenings with. She had talked about her life, her marriage, her son, the property, what she regretted and what she didn't. She had not talked about her will. Clara had never asked. Thomas Greer's office was on the second floor of a brick building on Millbridge's main street. He was a man in his 50s, medium height and slightly rumpled, with ink-stained fingers and the eyes of someone who had spent decades reading documents and had gotten very good at reading other things as well. He stood when Clara and Wes came in, and he shook both their hands, and he gestured to the chairs across from his desk with the air of a man who had something to say and intended to say it plainly. He looked at Wes. Miss Whitlock may prefer to have you present, Greer said, or she may prefer privacy. I'll follow her lead. Clara said, He stays. Greer nodded and opened the folder on his desk. I'll be direct, he said. It's the only way I know how to do this work, and in this particular situation, I believe directness serves everyone best. He began with what he knew. Agatha Holloway had consulted his firm some 14 months before her death, before the illness that had taken her while she was still fully competent to make legal decisions. She had not consulted the family solicitor, the man who had previously handled Holloway affairs, because she did not trust him. She had traveled to Millbridge specifically because she wanted an attorney with no connection to her son. She had made a second will. Clara's hands were very still in her lap. The second will, Greer explained, had been executed properly, witnessed by 2 members of his staff, and filed with his office. It left the bulk of the estate to Edgar, which was the same as the first will. But it also included specific bequests, Agatha's personal jewelry, a chest of quilts, and a collection of correspondence to her sister's estate, her library to the local reading society she'd supported for years, and to Clara Whitlock for faithful and devoted service across 15 years, a sum of $800, a set of personal possessions including her grandmother's china and 2 pieces of her own jewelry, and the small house on Fletcher Street in Harrows Creek that she had inherited from her own mother and kept as rental property. $800. A house. The question, Greer said carefully, watching Clara's face, is why Miss Whitlock is only hearing about this now, 14 months after Mrs. Holloway's death. He answered his own question. Edgar Holloway had known about the second will, had found a draft of it among his mother's papers while she was still living. Agatha had not known he'd found it. After her death, Edgar had presented only the first will for probate. He had withheld the existence of the second will entirely. He had, in short, stolen from the estate and from Clara, with the particular efficiency of a man who understood that the people he was stealing from had no resources to fight him. What he had not accounted for was Thomas Greer, who had been growing quietly and persistently more concerned for 7 months, since it had become clear that no second probate filing had occurred, and who had finally, after consulting with his colleagues about his professional obligations, decided to contact Clara directly. "You have legal standing," Greer said. "The will is valid. The bequest is yours. Edgar Holloway's withholding of this document is fraud, deliberate fraud, and there are remedies available to you. The question is whether you wish to pursue them." The room was quiet. Clara looked at the document on the desk in front of her. She could see Agatha's signature at the bottom of the page. That particular angular signature she recognized from years of household correspondence, and something moved through her that was not quite grief, and not quite relief, but lived in the same territory as both. She had not been forgotten. In the year before she died, while she was still capable of planning and deciding, Agatha Holloway had gone to a strange solicitor in another town, and she had made sure that Clara would be taken care of. She had done it quietly and carefully, and without telling anyone, because she had known Edgar well enough to know what he'd do if he found out before it was too late to stop it. She had known, and she had tried to protect Clara anyway, and Edgar had found the draft and beaten her to it. "Miss Whitlock," Greer's voice was careful. "I understand this is a great deal to receive at once." "Yes," Clara said. Her voice came out steadier than she expected. She was holding herself very still, the way she held herself when she was in the middle of something she couldn't afford to fall apart in. She looked at Wes. He was watching her, not with the look of a man waiting to tell her what to do, but with the look of a man who understood he was witnessing something that was hers and was making sure she knew he was there. "What do I need to do?" she said, turning back to Greer. "First, you sign an authorization allowing my office to act as your legal representative. Then we file a formal challenge to the probate of the first will, presenting the second will and the evidence of suppression. I have 2 witnesses who were present at the signing of the second will and who are prepared to testify. I also have the original signed document, which Edgar cannot claim he produced or destroyed, because it was never in his possession." Greer paused. "This will go before the territorial court in Calverton. It will take time. It will be uncomfortable. Edgar Holloway will fight it, because he has the money to fight it, and because men like him do not accept accountability without being forced into it." "Will we win?" Wes asked. Not we, as in he had inserted himself, but we as in he was asking on her behalf. Greer looked at him. "The evidence is clear, the document is valid, the witnesses are credible. If the court operates as it should—" He paused, with the care of a man who had spent decades in the law and had stopped making guarantees. "I believe you will prevail." Clara looked at the authorization form. She thought about Edgar Holloway's voice in the parlor, loud enough for the stable hands to hear. She thought about walking out through the iron gate with a carpet bag and 7 days' wages. She thought about what it meant that Agatha had tried, genuinely tried, and that what had stopped her was not her own failure, but her son's calculated cruelty. She picked up the pen. She signed. "What happens now?" she said. "Now," Greer said, "I write a great many letters, and Edgar Holloway discovers that his mother was more thorough than he realized." On the drive back, the first hour passed in almost total silence. The road unrolled ahead of them in the long summer light, and the land was the same land it had been 2 days ago, flat and wide and indifferent to human drama, but something in how Clara perceived it had shifted in a way she couldn't entirely account for. "You all right?" Wes said finally. "I don't know yet," she said. "I think so." She looked at the horizon. "She tried to protect me. She knew what Edgar was capable of, and she went to Millbridge, and she made arrangements, and she tried." Her voice was steady, but it was an effort. "And he still found a way." "He found a way to delay it," Wes said, "not stop it." She nodded. That was the right way to see it. She turned it over, trying to find where it settled in her. Not comfort, exactly. Too much had happened for simple comfort, but something honest. $800, she said. "It's a significant sum. And the house." The house on Fletcher Street. She didn't know it, had never seen it, but it was real, and it was hers, and the idea of owning something as solid and permanent as a house was so far outside anything she'd imagined when she walked out of the Holloway gate that she couldn't quite take it in all at once. Wes drove. The horses kept their pace. Biscuit would be waiting at the ranch, old and slow and faithful. "Edgar's going to be angry," she said. "Edgar's going to be more than angry. He's going to be humiliated in a territorial court. He'll blame me. He can blame you all he likes." Wes glanced at her, brief and direct in the way he had. "He doesn't have anything to use against you that he hasn't already used. And this time you have a lawyer and a valid legal document and 2 witnesses." He looked back at the road. He had a year to hide in. That's over now. Clara thought about what it would actually look like. The court proceedings, the testimony. Her name on a legal document in a territorial courthouse in Calverton, Edgar Holloway, sitting across a room while his fraud was laid out in front of a judge. She had spent 15 years being invisible in that house, moving through it efficiently and without fuss, a part of its machinery that everyone relied on and few actually saw. She was going to be very visible in Calverton. The thought was frightening. She was honest enough to admit that. It was also, underneath the fear, something she didn't have a clean word for. Not satisfaction. Not yet. But the beginning of it. The sense that a thing set wrong was being put back right, slowly and imperfectly and at real cost, but put right nonetheless. The ranch came into view in the late afternoon light, the windmill turning, the cattle visible in the south pasture. "Home," her mind said, before she could stop it, and she let it say it, because it wasn't wrong. Whatever came next was going to be hard. She knew that clearly. But she had already walked 11 miles of dark frontier road with a carpet bag and nowhere to go, and she had already started over in a stranger's house with nothing but her own capability and a very old skill her grandmother had given her. She would manage what came next. She would manage it because there was no alternative, and also because she was, it turned out, the kind of woman who managed things. Not easily, not without cost, but genuinely and for real, and without letting the fear be the last word. The letters from Thomas Greer arrived at irregular intervals through the summer, formal, measured, reporting developments in the language of a man who had chosen his profession partly because it rewarded patience. Edgar had retained counsel. Edgar's counsel had filed a motion challenging the validity of the second will on grounds of Agatha's mental competence at the time of signing. Greer had responded with the signed testimony of the attending physician who had examined Agatha 6 weeks before the Millbridge visit and found her entirely lucid. Edgar's counsel had then attempted to challenge the witnesses. Greer had anticipated this and had prepared accordingly. Clara read each letter at the kitchen table, usually in the morning before the day's work began, and then she folded it and put it in the small wooden box she'd bought in Harrow's Creek specifically for this purpose. Wes would look at her when she came back from the mailbox, and she would give him a brief summary, 1 or 2 sentences, whatever was essential. And he would nod and ask if there was anything she needed, and she would say not yet, and they would get on with the day. It was a strange thing to carry. The legal proceedings existed in a separate layer from everything else, from the garden and the cattle and the loom and the Friday drives to Harrow's Creek. And she had to work to keep them separate, because if she let the worry about Calverton bleed into the rest of it, she wouldn't be able to function, and she could not afford not to function. The weaving helped. More precisely, the weaving was the one part of her day that required enough of her conscious attention that there was no room left for calculating odds or imagining Edgar Holloway's face across a courtroom. When she was working through a complex pattern, she was only working through the pattern, and everything else fell back. She had understood this about hard physical work in a general way for most of her adult life, but she hadn't understood until the loom that mental work could do the same thing, that you could lose yourself in something demanding enough to crowd out the noise. She finished The River and Sky Blanket in July. It was the best thing she had made. She knew this not from pride, but from the simple evidence of looking at it. The pattern was tight and even, the color transitions exactly what she'd intended, the weight and drape of it right in a way that her earlier pieces had been approaching but not quite reaching. She held it up in the morning light from the loom room window and looked at it for a long time. She didn't take it to Ruth Adler. She kept it. She folded it and put it in the cedar chest in her room, on top of the quilts that had belonged to Wes's mother. She wasn't sure exactly why, only that some things you made were for selling, and some things you made were for keeping, and this one was for keeping. Ruth, when she heard about the blanket through whatever mechanism Ruth used to hear about things, was professionally disappointed but personally understanding. "You'll make another one," she said. "I know," Clara said, "but not the same one." Ruth had been watching the legal proceedings with the focused interest of a woman who believed that what happened to one woman in a community happened to all of them in some diffuse, important way. She had not said this directly. Ruth rarely said things that sounded like speeches, but she had made her position clear through smaller actions, mentioning Clara's work to people who came into the shop, writing a brief letter to Greer attesting to Clara's character when he'd asked for character witnesses. And once, after Dora Fitch had made a particularly pointed remark at the dry goods counter within Ruth's earshot, delivering a response so precisely targeted that Dora Fitch had not spoken of Clara Whitlock in Ruth's presence again. Clara had heard about this third hand and had not known what to do with the warmth it produced in her, which was still an unfamiliar sensation. The court date in Calverton was set for the 3rd week of September. Greer wrote with the particulars, which judge, what courtroom, what time, what she should expect. He wrote that he was confident in the merits, but wanted her to be prepared for Edgar to make the proceedings as unpleasant as possible. Edgar's strategy, as far as Greer had been able to determine, had shifted from challenging the will's validity, that avenue had become too difficult, to attacking Clara's character. He would attempt to make the case that any bequest to her was the product of an inappropriate relationship or undue influence over an elderly woman. Clara read this letter standing at the mailbox rather than carrying it inside. The morning was already warm, the light coming hard from the east, and a meadowlark was doing something complicated and cheerful in the grass nearby that she found difficult to reconcile with the letter in her hands. Undue influence. Inappropriate relationship. She had sat with Agatha Holloway through an influenza that had lasted 3 weeks, and left the old woman so weakened she couldn't walk the length of her own hallway without help. She had read to her when her eyes were too tired for her own books. She had kept the household running with less money than was adequate and without once, in 15 years, taking anything that didn't belong to her. And Edgar Holloway was going to stand in a courtroom and suggest that this had been manipulation. She folded the letter. She put it in her pocket. She stood at the mailbox for a moment longer than she needed to, looking out at the road that ran south toward Harrow's Creek, the same road she'd walked into that first dark evening almost a year ago. Then she went inside and told Wes. He read the letter at the table while she made coffee. She watched his jaw tighten slightly. A small movement, barely visible, but she had learned to read him. He set the letter down. "He's going to stand in that courtroom and say that to your face," Wes said. It wasn't a question. "His lawyer will say it," Clara said, "which is how men like Edgar work. They say the ugliest things through someone else's mouth so they can claim it was just legal strategy." "Can Greer counter it?" "Greer says yes. He has the testimony of the physician, the staff, and the witnesses to the will signing. He says the judge in Calverton has a reputation for not tolerating what he called," she quoted the letter from memory, "gratuitous attacks on a witness's character that are not supported by evidence." She poured the coffee. "But Greer also said to be prepared for it, meaning it's going to happen and I need to be able to sit through it." Wes looked at her. "Can you?" She thought about this honestly. She thought about the parlor and the stable hands and Edgar's voice carrying. "I sat through it once already," she said, "in front of people I'd worked beside for years, with nowhere to go afterward." She set his coffee in front of him. "This time I'll be sitting in a courtroom with a lawyer and a valid legal document and 2 witnesses, and afterward I'll go back to a place I live by choice." He was quiet for a moment. "I'm coming to Calverton." "You don't need to." "I know I don't need to." He looked at her steadily. "I'm coming." She didn't argue with him. She was tired of arguing against things that were offered without conditions. They left for Calverton on a Sunday, giving themselves 2 full days before the hearing. Ruth Adler came to the ranch the Saturday before they left, which Clara had not expected. She arrived with a box containing a good wool shawl she pressed on Clara, without sentiment. "It'll be cold in the courtroom, those buildings hold the cold something terrible," and sat at the kitchen table and drank coffee and talked about the weaving trade in Millbridge as if this were an ordinary visit, which it was not, and Clara appreciated the ordinariness of it more than she could say. Calverton was larger than Clara had imagined from the name. It had a proper main street with 2-story buildings, A hotel that was 3 stories and slightly too grand for its surroundings, a courthouse that had been built to communicate permanence, and more people moving through it on a Monday morning than passed through Harrow's Creek in a week. She and Wes checked into the hotel, separate rooms, which she had handled by simply asking for 2 rooms at the desk in the same tone she used to ask for anything else. And she met with Greer that afternoon in his colleague's office in Calverton, going over the sequence of the hearing and what would be required of her. "If they put you on the stand," Greer said, "answer exactly what is asked. Nothing more. Don't explain yourself unless they ask for an explanation. Don't respond to implications. Wait for the actual question." He paused. "And if Edgar Holloway's lawyer says something that is untrue about you, do not react visibly. I know that's difficult. But the judge will see how you carry yourself in that room, and it matters." "I understand," Clara said. "Have you ever testified in any legal proceeding before?" "No." "It's uncomfortable," Greer said. "It's designed to be uncomfortable. Edgar's counsel will try to make you feel as though you have something to be ashamed of. You don't, but the feeling can still get produced." He looked at her with the directness of a man who had seen this before and was trying to prepare her for it rather than pretend it away. "You seem to me like someone with considerable composure." "I seem that way because I've had a lot of practice not showing what I'm feeling," Clara said. "That's not exactly the same thing." Greer smiled briefly. It was the first time she'd seen him smile. "For our purposes, it will serve well enough." The hearing began on Tuesday morning. The courtroom was not as large as she had expected. She had imagined something theatrical: high ceilings, galleries, the weight of institution pressing down from every angle. The actual room was adequate, plain, with tall windows that let in the September light and wooden benches that were already populated when she and Greer arrived. She saw Edgar Holloway on the other side of the room with his attorney, a man she didn't know, narrow in the face and expensive in his suit. Edgar looked older than she remembered. Not better or worse, just older, the lines around his mouth deeper, and his posture carrying something tighter than it used to. He looked at her when she came in. She looked back. She held it for exactly 2 seconds, and then she looked away, because she was not going to give him any particular expression, and she was not going to look away first in a manner that communicated flight. She sat beside Greer and put her hands flat on the table in front of her and looked at the judge's bench. The judge was a man in his 60s named Harmon, compact and gray-haired, with the deliberate manner of someone who had been doing this long enough to have stopped finding it interesting as a spectacle and now simply wanted it done correctly. He called the proceeding to order without ceremony. Greer presented first. He laid it out with the efficiency Clara had come to associate with him. The first will, the second will, the timeline, the Millbridge visit, the proper execution and witnessing of the second document, the 14 months of silence during which the second will had been withheld, the specific bequests that had been denied their intended recipient. He submitted the original document. He called his first witness, a young man from his office named Daniel Porter, who had been present at the signing and who gave his testimony in a clear, steady voice that did not waver under cross-examination. He called his second witness, an older woman named Margaret Sow, who had also been present and who answered Edgar's lawyer's questions with a precision that made the questioning look imprecise. He called the physician who had examined Agatha 6 weeks before the Millbridge visit. The physician was thorough and technical and conclusive. Then Edgar's lawyer stood up. His name was Fitzsimmons, and he had the practiced smoothness of a man who had spent years in rooms like this one. He established first that Clara had been in close proximity to Mrs. Holloway for 15 years. He established that she had been present during periods of illness. He established that she had, by her own, and indeed everyone's, account, become something of a companion to the older woman in her final years. Then he said, in the careful tone of a man making a suggestion rather than an accusation, "Isn't it possible, Miss Whitlock, that your relationship with the deceased, whatever its origins, had evolved into something that gave you undue influence over her decisions in the final period of her life?" Clara looked at Fitzsimmons. She thought about what Greer had told her. Answer what is asked. Don't explain unless asked. Don't respond to implications. "No," she said. Fitzsimmons waited, clearly expecting more. She didn't give him more. "You cared for her personally during periods of illness," he said. "Yes." "And she began requesting your company in the evenings in a social capacity in her final year. Yes. Doesn't that suggest a degree of dependence, emotional dependence, on a woman in her employ that might compromise her independent judgment? Clara kept her face still. She thought about Agatha Holloway's eyes, sharp and direct and entirely themselves, right up until the last weeks. She thought about the deliberateness of the Millbridge trip, the planning required, the discretion. A woman who could organize that was not a woman whose judgment was compromised. No, she said. It suggests that she was a woman who, as she aged, chose to spend her evenings with someone she found reliable and honest rather than with people who wanted something from her. She paused one beat. I didn't want anything from her except my wages, which she paid on time. There was a silence in the room that had a particular texture. Fitzsimmons moved on. He tried 3 more variations of the same underlying argument over the next 20 minutes. Each time, Clara answered precisely, without elaboration, without visible emotion, without giving him the reaction he was trying to produce. She was aware of Wes in the gallery behind her. She couldn't see him, but she knew exactly where he was sitting because she'd noted it when she came in, and the awareness was steadying in a way that had nothing to do with needing to be saved. When Fitzsimmons sat down, Greer rose for his redirect, which was brief and targeted. He asked Clara to describe, in her own words, what had been done with her wages over 15 years. She described it. Regular wages, standard deductions for room and board, no irregularities. He asked if she had ever requested money, gifts, or consideration beyond her employment terms. She said no. He asked if Mrs. Holloway had ever, to her knowledge, expressed an intention to include her in the estate. She said no. She had not known until Thomas Greer's letter. Greer sat down. The judge spent a moment reviewing his notes in a silence that was not dramatic but was absolute. The second will, Judge Harmon said, is properly executed, properly witnessed, and there is no credible evidence that the testator lacked capacity at the time of its creation. The argument of undue influence is not supported by the evidence presented. The suppression of this document during probate constitutes— He looked at Edgar Holloway with an expression that was not angry, but was, Clara thought, something close to contemptuous. A serious failure of legal and ethical obligation. The bequests specified in the second will are legally valid and will be honored in full. He gave Edgar 30 days to comply. Edgar said nothing. He sat with his expensive lawyer and his tighter posture and his older face, and he said nothing, and after a moment he gathered his papers and left. He did not look at Clara. Clara sat at the table and let the room come back to her. Greer was already organizing his documents. He looked at her. You did very well, he said. You did most of it, she said. You did the part that can't be taught. He closed his folder. I'll be in touch about the transfer of assets. The house on Fletcher Street should be straightforward. The monetary bequest may take a few weeks to clear through the estate. She shook his hand and thanked him, and then she turned around and walked out of the courtroom into the hallway, where Wes was standing by the window at the far end. She crossed to him. He looked at her and she looked at him, and neither of them said anything for a moment. It's done, he said. It's done. He nodded slowly. He looked out the window at the Calverton Street, the ordinary Tuesday traffic of a territorial town, people going about the business of their lives. How do you feel? Clara considered the question. She tried to find an answer that was honest rather than what she was expected to say. Strange, she said. I feel strange. Not bad, just— She stopped. I kept thinking in there that Agatha should be here for this, that she planned all of it and she didn't get to see it work. She looked at the window. And I kept thinking about Edgar's face when the judge ruled, and I thought I'd feel something larger than I did, something more like— She shook her head. Justice is supposed to feel bigger than it does, Wes said. Not making it better, just recognizing it. Yes, she said. Exactly that. They stood there for another moment in the hallway with the ordinary sounds of the building around them. Then Clara straightened and picked up her bag. I want to see Fletcher Street before we leave tomorrow, she said. I want to see the house. Fletcher Street was 3 blocks from the courthouse, which she suspected was not accidental. Agatha had always had a practical sense of geography. The house was small, 2 rooms and a kitchen with a sleeping loft, built in a style that had been modest when it was new and was now simply unassuming. The current tenants were not at home. Clara stood on the street and looked at it for a while. The front window, the plain door, the narrow yard with a rose bush growing along the fence that had not been particularly well tended but was still alive and had clearly been there a long time. It was hers. She had never owned anything that couldn't fit in a carpet bag, and now she owned a house with a rose bush that needed attention and tenants who paid rent that would go into the ledger she kept in the drawer of her chest at West Dalton's ranch. She stood on the street and looked at the house and felt the strangeness of it. The weight of something real and permanent that was entirely hers, not earned by connection to someone else's life, but specifically, deliberately left to her by a woman who had decided she deserved it. Wes stood beside her and looked at the house too. "What are you going to do with it?" he said. "Keep the tenants," she said. "For now. The rent will help." "Help with what?" "With the loom," she said. "I want to buy a second one. Expand what I'm making. Ruth says the trader in Millbridge could take twice what I'm currently producing." She paused. "And I want to hire someone to help with the weaving side. I can't run the household here and manage the volume she's asking for without more hands." Wes was quiet for a moment. "If you hire someone, you'll need more space than the room off the kitchen." "I know." She looked at the house on Fletcher Street. "I've been thinking about the second outbuilding, the one that just holds old equipment. I was going to rebuild that shed this fall anyway. Could you make it larger?" He looked at her sidelong. "How much larger?" "Large enough for 2 looms," she said, "with good light." He looked out at the street. He didn't say anything for a moment, and then he said, "That's a permanent kind of arrangement." She looked at him. She understood what he was saying. It was that building a larger outbuilding specifically to house her expanded business was a different kind of commitment than giving her access to a room off the kitchen, that it meant they were both assuming she'd be there for a long time, that it made something implicit, explicit, and structural and harder to undo. "Yes," she said. "I know." He met her eyes. The afternoon light came from the west and lay flat across the street, and the ordinary houses, and the rose bush that needed tending. He held her gaze for a moment in that way he had, direct, without performance. "All right," he said. "I'll start on the framing when we get back." They walked back to the hotel through the Tuesday afternoon of Calverton, and Clara carried the strangeness with her and let it settle slowly into something she'd be able to live inside. The knowledge that she was not the woman who'd walked out of the Holloway gate anymore. She was not that woman, and she was not going back to being that woman, and the distance between that version of herself and this one had been built slowly and imperfectly and at real cost out of hard work and clear thinking and the quiet, undemanding steadiness of a man who fixed things because they needed fixing and didn't ask for anything in return. She was not finished yet. She knew that. There was still the wait for the assets to transfer, still the question of the business and what it could become, still all the ordinary difficulty of a life being rebuilt from particular materials into a particular shape. None of it was done, but the thing that Edgar had stolen from her, the thing that mattered more than money or property or any of it, that she had gotten back. The knowledge that she had not been invisible, that the woman she'd worked for had seen her, had valued her, had tried to make it right. That was hers now, and no probate court or expensive lawyer could touch it. She walked through Calverton in the September light, and she let herself feel it, the whole complicated weight of it, without trying to make it simpler or larger or cleaner than it was. It was enough. It was, in fact, more than enough. The monetary bequest arrived in October, transferred through Greer's office in a bank draft that Clara held in her hands for a long moment before she took it to the small bank in Harrows Creek and deposited it. $800. She had never held that much money in her life. She had never expected to. The teller, a young man who was trying to grow a mustache with limited success, counted it out and gave her a receipt and said, "Congratulations, Miss Whitlock," in a tone that suggested he'd heard something about the Calverton proceedings, because everyone in Harrows Creek had heard something about the Calverton proceedings. She thanked him and folded the receipt into her coat pocket and walked out into the October street and stood in the cold for a moment, the wind moving through town from the north, smelling like frost and dead grass and the particular sharpness of approaching winter. $800. A house with tenants who paid on time, a loom room that was about to become a proper workshop. She walked back to where Wes had the wagon waiting and climbed up and said, "It's done." He nodded and they drove back to the ranch in the thin October sunshine, Biscuit appearing from the pasture to run the last quarter mile alongside them, gray-muzzled and slower than she used to be, but committed to the ritual nonetheless. The new workshop went up in 3 weeks. Wes framed it himself with Pete's help, and Clara made decisions about the windows. She wanted east and south light, which meant more framing work than a simpler design would have required, and Wes did it without comment. And by the time the first hard freeze came, the building was enclosed and had a small iron stove in the corner that could heat the space adequately for working. She moved the original loom from the room off the kitchen into the new building, and the second loom, purchased with the inheritance money from a craftsman in Millbridge who built them to order, arrived in December, lashed to a freight wagon and requiring 4 men to carry inside. Clara stood in the middle of the workshop with both looms in place and the winter light coming through the east windows, and she thought, "This is real. This is not something she was maintaining for someone else. This was hers, built with her own work and her own money and her own choices, on land that belonged to another person but where she had been given genuine space to exist." The woman she hired was named Bess Hartley, 22 years old, the youngest daughter of a farming family 2 miles north of the ranch. Bess had no weaving experience whatsoever, which Clara had decided was preferable to someone with bad habits she'd have to correct. She was quick-handed and patient and made the same mistake 3 times before she made it a 4th, which Clara considered the necessary pace of learning a physical skill. By February, Bess could manage the simpler patterns independently, which freed Clara to work on the more technically demanding pieces and to spend more of her mornings on the household and the accounts. The accounts. She had a proper ledger now, not the small plain one from before, but a real business ledger, and the numbers in it had begun to tell a story she found both satisfying and slightly vertiginous. Ruth's arrangement with the Millbridge trader had expanded. He was now requesting delivery every 6 weeks instead of every 10, and Ruth had, with characteristic practicality, suggested a price renegotiation that Clara had gone into prepared and come out of with terms she was genuinely satisfied with. The blankets were selling in Calverton now, in a shop there that catered to a clientele willing to pay for quality, and Ruth had mentioned, carefully, without pressure, that there had been an inquiry from a merchant in a city 300 miles east who had seen one of the pieces and wanted to discuss a larger arrangement. 300 miles east. She was 39 years old and her work was traveling to places she'd never been, which was a fact she turned over sometimes in the evenings, the way you turned over something you'd found on the ground, not quite believing it was as real as it felt in your hand. The winter was long and the ranch was close, and she and Wes existed in their familiar proximity, which had shifted in the months since Calverton in ways that were not dramatic and were not named but were real. She noticed it in small things, that she had stopped bracing for the condition to reveal itself because it had become clear that there wasn't one, that she had started saying things to him in the evenings, opinions, observations, things she actually thought, instead of only the practical information they needed to share. That when she came in from the workshop in the afternoons and he was already in the kitchen, starting the coffee because he knew she'd want it, the ordinariness of this felt like something she needed to be careful with, the way you were careful with things that could break. She did not know exactly when it had changed. She suspected it had been changing the whole time, slowly and without announcement, the way the light changed through a long afternoon, not any single moment you could point to, just the accumulated movement from one state to another. She didn't say anything about it, and neither did he. What they had was working. The ranch worked, the business worked, their daily life together worked, and she had learned enough about fragile things to know that sometimes the best thing you could do was not touch them. March came in difficult. One of the cattle contracted a respiratory illness and spread it through part of the herd before Wes caught it. And there were 2 weeks of long days and short sleep while he and Pete managed the sick animals, and Clara kept the household running on reduced attention and brought food to the barn at hours that weren't meals, and Bess managed the workshop largely alone with Clara, checking her work in the evenings. 3 animals died. Wes came in the night the third one died and sat down at the kitchen table and put his hands flat on the table and looked at them. Clara set a plate in front of him and sat down across from him and didn't say anything. He ate. After a while he said, "That's $200 of loss." "I know. I should have caught it 3 days earlier." "You caught it when you caught it," she said. "What would 3 days earlier have looked like?" He was quiet, going back through it. "I noticed something was off on the Friday. I thought it was the cold, the way they were standing. I should have called it sooner. You were managing 4 other things on that Friday. Still, she looked at him. Wes, you lost 3 animals and saved the rest of the herd in 2 weeks. That's not a failure. He looked at the plate. It's not what I wanted. No, she said. But what we get and what we wanted aren't usually the same thing. What matters is what we do with what we get. She paused. You'd tell me the same thing. He looked up at her. He held her gaze for a moment with an expression she couldn't entirely read, and then he said quietly, Yes, I would. He looked back at his food. You're good at this, you know that. At what? At saying the real thing instead of the comfortable thing. She thought about this. I had a long time to practice saying comfortable things, she said. I'm still getting used to the other kind. Spring arrived and with it a letter from Greer, the last one she expected to receive, confirming that all probate matters were fully resolved and his office's involvement was concluded. He wished her well in a way that was formal and genuine at the same time, which was very much how she had experienced him, and she wrote him back a letter that she hoped communicated real gratitude without being excessive. And she put the legal folder in the wooden box with the rest of the correspondence, and put the box in the cedar chest in her room and closed the lid. It was finished, the whole of it, the accusation, the gate closing in her face, the dark road, the discovery, the courtroom, all of it was finished and settled and filed away. And she was still here, still standing, still building. She was in the workshop on a Tuesday afternoon in May when Wes came in. He didn't usually come into the workshop. He respected the space the way she respected the barn, as a working domain that belonged to the person who ran it. She looked up from the loom when she heard the door. Bess had gone home an hour ago. The late afternoon light was coming through the south window and laying long across the floor. It was warm enough now that the iron stove was cold, and the workshop smelled of lanolin and wood and the particular dry smell of worked wool. Wes stood by the door for a moment. He had his hat in his hands, which she noted. Is something wrong? She said. No. He looked at her. Can you stop for a minute? She let the shuttle rest and turned to face him. He was not a man who fumbled, generally. He spoke carefully, and he said what he meant, and he didn't use more words than were needed, which she had come to think of as one of his fundamental qualities. But he was clearly picking his way through something now, and the care with which he was doing it made her still. You own a house, he said. You've got a business that's going to keep growing. You've got money in the bank. He looked at her steadily. You're not here because you have to be. You've been not here because you have to be for a while now, actually. Since at least October. He paused. I want you to know I understand that. I want you to know I haven't said anything because I wasn't going to say something just because the situation made it feel convenient. Clara looked at him. She held herself very still, the way she held herself when something important was happening, and she wanted to receive it clearly. I'm saying something now, he said, because it's been long enough that I don't think it's the situation talking. I think it's just... He stopped. He looked at the hat in his hands. I'd like to marry you, Clara, if you want that. And if you don't, I'd like you to know that nothing changes. You stay. This is your workshop and your room and your place at this table, and none of that is conditional. He looked up. I'm not offering you less if you say no. I'm just telling you what I want. The workshop was very quiet. The late light moved slightly as the wind shifted the shadows outside. She had thought about this. She knew herself well enough to be honest about that. She had thought about it, not in the way of planning, but in the way of something you circled around without letting yourself look at directly, the way you didn't look directly at the sun. She had thought about it when he came into the kitchen and started the coffee in the afternoon. She had thought about it during the cattle illness, when she'd seen him sit down at the table with his hands flat, and his face carrying something she recognized as the particular exhaustion of a person trying not to show how hard a thing had hit them. She had thought about it on the drive back from Calverton, with the September light on the road, and the feeling of something deciding itself. And she had also, she was honest about this too, been afraid. Not of him, of the shape of it, of becoming again something defined by a household, by another person's structure, by an arrangement that looked from the outside like the same thing she'd done for 15 years and gotten thrown out of. But what she and Wes had built was not the same thing she'd had at the Holloway house, and she knew the difference because she'd lived both, and the difference was not small. At the Holloway house, she had been indispensable and invisible. Here she was neither. Here she was a person who owned property and ran a business and said the real thing instead of the comfortable thing. And Wes Dalton had made more space for that version of her than anyone else ever had. She said, "You've been patient." "I wasn't being patient," he said. "I was waiting until it made sense to say it. There's a difference." She almost smiled. "That sounds like something I would say." "You probably taught me it." She looked at him. The man who had given up his saddle so she could ride 2 miles in the dark, who had fixed the loom without being asked, who had come to Calverton and sat in the gallery and not once told her what to do with what was hers. The man who started the coffee in the afternoons and laughed at infrequent intervals and lost 3 cattle and took it hard and listened when she told him the real thing. He was not perfect. She had watched him be wrong about things and stubborn about things and closed off in ways that she had to work around sometimes rather than through. He tracked mud and he forgot to tell her when the supply of lamp oil was running low, and there had been one argument in February about the workshop schedule and a delivery commitment she'd made that conflicted with something he'd needed the wagon for, and it had been a real argument, not a polite disagreement, and they'd both said things that were more pointed than necessary, and it had taken 2 days to fully settle. She wanted those 2 days. She wanted the argument and the mud and the forgotten lamp oil. She wanted the real version of this, which was what it already was, and she wanted to stop circling around what she'd been circling around and simply choose it. "Yes," she said, "I'd like that." He looked at her for a moment. Something in his face changed in a way that was not dramatic and was not performed and was, she thought, one of the most honest things she'd seen on a person's face. "All right," he said. They were married in June, in the workshop, which was Wes's suggestion, and had surprised her until he explained that the house was too small and the ranch yard was too exposed to weather, and the workshop was, he said simply, where she actually lived, which was true. She had spent more hours in that building than anywhere else on the ranch, and the walls of it held the rhythm of the loom and the smell of wool and the particular quality of concentration that came from making something difficult with your hands. Ruth Adler came. Pete and his wife came. Bess Hartley came with her mother. Thomas Greer sent a letter that arrived the week before the ceremony and that Clara read once and then put in the cedar chest because she didn't have adequate words for it. It was not a grand occasion. The food was good because Clara cooked it, and the workshop was clean and the looms were threaded, and the river and sky blanket that she'd folded into the cedar chest almost a year ago was hung on the wall because Wes had found it there and asked her what it was for, and she hadn't had an answer until now. The ceremony was brief. The words were plain. Afterward, Ruth said, "You look like yourself," which was not a typical thing to say to a bride, and was, Clara thought, exactly the right thing. Life after that continued in the way that life continued. Not transformed, not unrecognizable, but itself, accumulated in layers. Bess Hartley stayed on and got better, and eventually, by the following spring, was producing work that Clara could sell without qualifying it. The merchant from the city 300 miles east turned out to be serious, and the arrangement Ruth had mentioned became real, and Clara's blankets traveled further than she had ever been, and probably further than she would ever go, which she had made her peace with because she had learned the difference between the place your work reached and the place where your life actually was, and she had chosen her life. The house on Fletcher Street continued to have tenants. She visited it twice a year to check on its condition, standing on the street outside and looking at the rosebush, which she had eventually paid someone to prune properly, and thinking about Agatha Holloway, who had stood in a solicitor's office in Millbridge and made sure that this house would belong to someone who deserved it. She thought about Agatha often, not with the weight of grief anymore, but with something quieter, a kind of companionable memory, the way you carried people who had mattered. Edgar Holloway left the territory. She heard this through Ruth, who had heard it from someone in Harrow's Creek, who had connections in the town where the Holloway property was. He had sold the house and the land at less than they were worth, and gone east, and no one seemed to know where, and Clara did not spend time wondering. He had taken something from her and had been made to give it back, and that was the end of what she needed from him. She did not forgive him, exactly. She was not sure forgiveness was the right word for what happened to her feelings about Edgar Holloway over time. What happened was more like a gradual loosening of the grip she'd had on the anger, not because the anger wasn't warranted, but because holding on to it tightly required energy that she needed for other things. The anger didn't disappear. It just stopped being the most important thing in the room. What she understood, in the particular way you understood things that had been lived rather than learned. What she came to understand about all of it, about the gate closing in her face, and the dark road, and the carpet bag, and everything that came after, was that the worst thing Edgar had done to her was not the theft of the money, or the house, or the inheritance. The worst thing he had done was try to make her believe that the 15 years she'd given to that household had produced nothing, meant nothing, been seen by no one. Agatha had spent the last year of her life proving that was wrong, and a solicitor in Millbridge had made sure the proof survived. You could work faithfully and be genuinely seen by the person you were working for. You could be thrown out and still not be erased. The value of what you did not depend on whether the people who benefited from it chose to acknowledge it. These were not comfortable truths. They didn't resolve the loss of 15 years or the cruelty of the night she'd walked that road. But they were true, and she had needed to discover them the hard way. And she thought that discovering hard truths the hard way was possibly the only way they actually stayed discovered. The ranch grew, not dramatically, but steadily. Wes bought the adjacent parcel 2 years after the marriage, adding grazing land and an additional water source, and Pete's 2 younger brothers came on as permanent hands, which meant the bunkhouse was fuller and the cattle operation ran with less strain on any single person. The kitchen garden became something she was genuinely proud of, not as a vanity, but because good produce mattered and she grew it well. The dog Biscuit died in the 2nd year, peacefully and in her usual place by the kitchen stove, and they buried her in the yard and missed her in the specific way you missed an animal who had been the particular consistent background to a whole period of your life. They got another dog eventually, a young one, ridiculous and undisciplined and full of the careless confidence of animals who had never had anything bad happen to them. Clara watched the dog tear across the yard one morning in pursuit of nothing visible, all 4 legs barely coordinating, and she felt something she could only describe as uncomplicated happiness, which was different from the complex, qualified, hard-won kind she was more accustomed to. She let herself feel it without analyzing it, which was something she was still learning. The loom room, the workshop, was the place she went to think, not to escape, because this was her life and she did not need to escape from it, but to locate herself. There was something about the physical rhythm of the shuttle, the necessity of counting and tracking, the slow accumulation of pattern from individual threads, that organized her mind in a way nothing else did. She understood things at the loom that she hadn't understood sitting at a table. She had worked out the hard question of her winter argument with Wes at the loom, and she had worked out what to say to Bess when Bess's father died, and she had worked out her complicated feelings about being 40 and then 41 and then 42 at the loom, the physical reality of her body in a sedentary craft, the aches in her hands on cold mornings that her grandmother had warned her about and she had not, at 18, taken seriously. At 42, she took them seriously. She bought a pair of wool gloves to wear before starting work on cold mornings, and she was annoyed by the necessity, and she wore them anyway. On a Sunday evening in November, 4 years after she had walked out of the Holloway gate with a carpet bag and nowhere to go, Clara sat in the workshop after everyone else had gone home, and she held the shuttle in her gloved hands, and she looked at the piece she was working on. It was a commission, her first formal commission, from a family in Calverton who had seen her work in the shop there and wanted something specific, a particular size and color, a pattern that one of the women had seen in a book and brought in a sketch of. Clara had looked at the sketch and modified it substantially, because what looked right on paper and what would work in wool were different things, and she knew the difference, and the client had agreed after Clara explained why. She was 42 years old. She had a husband and a business and a house she rented to strangers, and a workshop with 2 looms and a ledger that told a story she could not have imagined 4 years ago. She had a woman named Bess who came to work every morning and was learning to manage the simpler client conversations without Clara's oversight. She had a kitchen garden and a dog and a cedar chest full of things that mattered. She had also, she knew, gotten lucky. She knew this clearly and without embarrassment because denying luck when you'd had it was a kind of dishonesty she didn't have patience for. She had been lucky that Wes Dalton had been on that road that evening, and had been the specific kind of man he was, rather than any of the other kinds he might have been. She had been lucky that Thomas Greer was the kind of attorney who felt a professional obligation that inconvenienced him. She had been lucky that Ruth Adler bought crafts and had standards and believed in the principle of women with their own income. But luck arrived at the door. You still had to open it. You still had to decide what to do with what was on the other side. You still had to do the work. She had done the work. She was still doing the work. She expected to be doing the work for a long time. She set the shuttle moving again. The workshop was warm from the stove, and the light was the good indoor light of a November evening, close and amber and without the glare of summer. And outside, the wind was doing the things it did on the plains in November, which was mostly trying to remind you that the world was larger and more indifferent than any single life inside it. She knew that. She had learned it on a dark road with a carpet bag and 7 days' wages. And she had also learned it the hard way, which was the only way it stuck, that the world being large and indifferent was not the same as your life meaning nothing. The smallness of a single life inside an enormous world was not a tragedy. It was just the condition. What you built inside it, who you chose to build it with, whether you showed up faithfully to the work that was actually yours, that was what you had to work with. The shuttle moved. The pattern grew. Outside, the wind crossed the open range and the stars were beginning to show in the clear November sky. The same sky she'd looked at through the window of a spare room 4 years ago when she was deciding whether or not to stay. She had stayed. She was glad she had stayed. The loom kept its rhythm, steady and particular and hers, and the work continued.